Hello everyone, welcome to Achievers IS classes. I wish you all a very happy new year and welcome you to the third part of the yearly roundup where we look into the important issues of the month July, August and September. The first issue is regarding the Supreme Court's verdict in the power struggle between the Union government and the government of the National Capital Territory of Delhi. A five-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court has unanimously held that the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi is bound by the aid and advice of the elected Delhi government, and in case of a difference of opinion, the LG should straightaway refer the dispute to the President for a final decision on the matter. It therefore concluded that governance of Delhi cannot rest upon the whims of one functionary, that is the Lieutenant Governor, because the Lieutenant Governor has not been entrusted with any independent decision making powers but has to act either on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers or he is bound to implement the decision taken by the President on a reference made by him. This is in contrast to the verdict of the Delhi High Court in 2016, which had declared that the LG had complete control of all matters regarding the National Capital Territory of Delhi and nothing will happen without the concurrence of the LG. Further, the Supreme Court has advised both the central government and the Delhi government to show statesmanship, adopt combined action, and sincere cooperation to achieve the common objective by coining a term known as collaborative federalism. Because ultimately, it's the people who are sovereign, and the decisions of the elected government in Delhi represent the public will, perception, and popular sentiment. In this regard, the Supreme Court has observed that a legitimate decision of the Council of Ministers cannot be withheld due to the negative attitude of the Lieutenant Governor. On the question of statehood, the Supreme Court followed the 1987 Balakrishnan report to conclude that Delhi is not a state. The report had held that Delhi could not have a situation in which the national capital had two governments run by different political parties which could lead to conflicts and undermine national interest. Well, this is a landmark judgment, and there can be a question on the concept of federalism itself. Therefore, go through it in detail. The next issue is regarding the simultaneous election. The Law Commission had held consultations with several political parties on the proposal for simultaneous elections, on which the political parties are deeply divided and many terming it as unconstitutional and impractical. The idea of simultaneous elections has obvious advantages, like there would be a drastic cut in the election expenditure, and also the government will be able to focus more on the legislation and the governance aspect rather than having to be in the campaign mode forever. However, it has many practical difficulties also because national issues may get precedence over local issues, as well as the synchronization of the elections would involve either curtailment of the term or extension of the term of a house, the legal propriety of which is questionable. One of the solutions put forth is holding of elections for one group of states with the 2019 election and for the rest after 2.5 years and from there on every 30 months. Further, there is also a proposal for a constructive vote of no confidence where legislators must also propose an alternative if the ruling regime falls due to lack of majority in the House. The other recommendations include granting of a one-time waiver of the anti-defection law to enable the House to elect a leader in the event of a hung assembly, and also if a midterm election has to be held, the term of such an election would only be for the remainder of its tenure. However, it is unclear if political parties are willing to invest their time and resources in an election where they get to form the government for a reduced term. What is important is several of these reforms can be adopted even without adopting the simultaneous elections itself, and there are many pressing reforms like curbing the use of black money in elections and tackling the staggered manner in which these elections are held in many of the states. Now let's look into some of the legislative and government policy issues. The first one is the report submitted by the Law Commission, which has said that it is impossible to stop illegal gambling and the only viable option left is to regulate gambling in sports. The Commission has recommended cashless gambling in sports as a means to increase revenue as well as discourage unlawful gambling. Further, it suggests that the money generated through the regulation of such activities can be used for public welfare measures for which changes under the Income Tax Act and the Goods and Services Act have to be brought in accordingly. For this to happen, it suggests that the gamblers and operators should be linked to their Aadhaar and PAN cards so that the government can track such activities and also introduce a cap on the number of gambling transactions for each individual as well as restrictions on the amount which it has recommended to be prescribed while using electronic money facilities such as credit cards, debit cards, net banking, etc. The Commission has also recommended classification of proper gambling and small gambling, where proper gambling would be for the rich who play for high stakes, while small gambling would be for the low income groups. Further, it has said that regulations should be put in place to protect the vulnerable groups, minors, and those below the poverty line who derive their sustenance from social welfare measures, subsidies, and Jandan account holders from exploitation through gambling. In order to encourage investment in the casino or online gaming industry, the Commission has recommended amendment to the Foreign Exchange Management and the Foreign Direct Investment laws as the sector has the potential to propel tourism as well as employment. However, one of the members of the Law Commission has expressed strong dissent, saying that the Law Commission's report was not comprehensive and a country as poor as India should not allow legalized gambling, which could only benefit certain vested interests who want legalization of gambling. Further, he criticized the Commission for exceeding its mandate given by the Supreme Court in 2016, which had asked the Commission to look into the question of legalizing betting in cricket but not sports as a whole. The next issue which we will discuss is the recent amendments to the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988. The law was initially promulgated in order to combat corruption, but Section 13(1)(d) of the Act was criticized, under which the public servants were culpable for securing a pecuniary advantage without any public interest. This resulted in many honest officials being prosecuted even when they gained nothing and were only exercising their power or discretion in favor of someone. Therefore, it had a chilling effect on governance and deterred bold decision making, which the recent amendments seek to address. The amendments make it more concise and restricts criminal misconduct to mainly two offences, that is, misappropriating the property entrusted to a public servant and amassing unexplained wealth. Further, it has been explained that a person shall be presumed to have intentionally enriched himself if he or she cannot account for his or her assets through known sources of income. Along with these amendments, it has made citizens liable for offering a bribe to a public servant, which is in line with the UN Convention Against Corruption, the only exception being when one is coerced to give a bribe, in which case he can report to the law enforcement authorities within a period of 7 days. However, there is no clarity on the options available to the people when the police or any other agency refuses to register a complaint. Further, the introduction of the prior approval norm to start an investigation is seen as creating another layer of protection in the initial stage of the probe itself, which is seen as undesirable by several activists. What needs to be remembered here is a public servant needs to be protected against unfair prosecution, but a genuine drive against corruption should be strengthened by creating an ombudsman in the form of a Lokpal or Lokayukta, as well as assure citizens of time-bound services and whistleblower protection. In essence, there has to be a balance between protecting honest public servants and prevention of corruption. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which was regarding cricket administration in India and the Justice R.M. Lodha Committee's recommendations. As you know, the Lodha Committee was constituted to look into the functioning of the BCCI, and it had suggested several reforms ranging from cooling off period to the issue of legalizing betting. The Supreme Court had accepted several of these recommendations but has diluted its stance in the recent judgment, like the cooling off period is now applicable after two 3-year terms, which was earlier was mandatory after one 3-year term. The RM Lodha Committee had recommended mandatory cool-off period after every term to ensure that the office bearers of the BCCI do not establish their personal fiefdoms, but there is also an argument against it that the experience and knowledge gained by the office bearers should not be frittered away, and a second term could help them consolidate their learnings. The recent ruling of the Supreme Court has accepted this logic because there is a 9-year aggregate limit as well as an age limit of 70 years for any office bearer, which could prevent any misuse by the office bearers. Further, on the one state, one vote norm, the RM Lodha Committee had recommended that associations representing a region within a state or entities that do not represent a territory should not have the same vote or status as that of the other members, which has now been overruled. Consequently, Gujarat and Maharashtra will have 3 votes each due to multiple associations in the state. In this too, the court has accepted that the associations which had contributed significantly to Indian cricket need not be stripped of their full membership. There are apprehensions that this may lead to the manipulation of votes. However, judicial intervention in the recent past has been immensely helpful in making the cricket administration more efficient, professional, as well as address the credibility deficit in the functioning of the BCCI. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the DAF Data Protection Bill. The expert panel, headed by Justice B.N. Srikrishna, has proposed that critical personal data of Indian citizens be processed in centers located within the country. As per the bill, personal data is any data of a natural person who is directly or indirectly identifiable with regard to any specific characteristic, trait, attribute, or any other feature of identity of such a natural person. The committee has defined personal data in such broad terms but has left it to the government to notify categories of personal data which will be considered critical. For other personal data which are not critical, it suggests that it can be transferred outside the territory of India provided that at least one copy of the data will be stored in India. The Act will apply to all those entities carrying on business in India or other activities such as profiling, data processing, etc., which could cause privacy breach. The draft also provides for penalties for the data processor as well as the compensation to the victim for the violations of the data protection law. In this regard, it has suggested a penalty of either 15 crore rupees or 4% of the total worldwide turnover of any data collection or processing entity for violating the provisions of the bill. Further, it has added that the processing of sensitive personal data should only be on the basis of explicit consent of the data principal. The committee has also clarified that the law will not have any retrospective effect and will come into force in a structured and phased manner. On the critical issue of the right to be forgotten, which refers to the ability of the individuals to limit, delink, delete, or correct the personal information on the internet that is misleading or irrelevant lies with the individual. Therefore, the bill seeks to strike a balance between the freedom of expression and the right to informational privacy, but at the same time, it has recommended that the processing of data for certain interests, such as the security of the state, legal proceedings, research and journalistic purposes may be exempt from certain obligations of the proposed data protection law. On the issue of personal data of children, the committee has differentiated between two types of data processing entities. The first, which provided services like YouTube, Hot Wheels, Walt Disney, and the second, which constituted the social media services such as Facebook and Instagram. The committee recommends that the Data Protection Authority will have the power to designate websites or online services that process large volumes of personal data of children as guardian data fiduciaries, thereby placing the onus of properly processing the data of a child on the company itself, which is preferable to the existing regulatory approach, which is based on the sole consent of the parent. This will go a long way in addressing various issues like behavioral monitoring, tracking, and targeted advertising, which may not be in the best interest of the child. For the implementation of the above recommendations, the committee has recommended to set up a data protection authority which will be in charge of ensuring that the data processing entities act in accordance with the law. Now let's move on to the next issue, which was on Odisha's proposal for a national policy on the establishment of legislative council in states. As of now, only 7 states in the country consist of such councils, the utility of which is questionable due to the lack of broad political consensus. Because if there was any real benefit in having a legislative council, all the states in the country would have had a second chamber and there would be political consensus on this issue. The process of creating a upper house in the state is lengthy, starting from the resolution passed from the state assembly to the subsequent enactment of a law by the parliament in order to create it. In this regard, two bills introduced in the Rajya Sabha in 2013 for establishing legislative councils in Assam and Rajasthan are still pending, indicating the lack of support for such a move. A parliamentary committee which looked into these bills cleared the proposals but had given a cautionary note, and it also wanted a national policy on having an upper house in a state legislature so that a subsequent government does not abolish it. It also favored review of the provisions in the law for the state councils which reserve seats for graduates and teachers. While it is advantageous that the upper house provides forum for academicians and intellectuals which is beneficial for the appraisal of a legislation, but the forum is likely to be used to accommodate party functionaries who fail to get elected rather than its lofty objective of getting intellectuals into the legislature. This is an unnecessary drain on the exchequer, and also, given the fact of dipping educational standards, questions arise on why should graduates be privileged as people's representatives in a democracy when state legislatures itself have several members with better educational backgrounds like doctors, teachers, etc. There is a differentiation, however, made in the case of Rajya Sabha as it represents the states rather than any electoral constituencies and also acts as a check against the dominance of elected majorities in legislative matters. In contrast, legislative councils are subject to varied and inconclusive discussions around their creation, revival, as well as abolishment. Given all this, Odisha's proposal may give the country an opportunity to evolve a national consensus on the utility of these legislative councils. On that note, let's move on to the next issue on the draft National Register of Citizens, which was published recently in Assam. As per the draft NRC, around 4 lakh people have not been included in the list, thereby creating great anxiety about the legal status of these individuals. Although the exercise was Supreme Court mandated and also monitored by it, and even a skillfully devised system has been put in place, like the digitized mapping of family trees, factors like human interface, subjective bias, and the inherent flaws in the NRC of 1951 and the electoral rolls of 1961 and 1971 have to be considered because Even in the recent draft, there have been notable omissions, including serving and former legislators as well. The government also has a larger responsibility to ensure that people who have lived there for a long time are not deported as illegal immigrants. On that front, both the central and state governments need to step up their assurances that there is no need for panic. In this regard, the Union Home Ministry has enabled the applicants to move to the Foreigners Tribunal to redress their grievances. The challenges ahead, like determining the precise number of deemed illegal immigrants, have to be handled carefully so that they are not rendered stateless on the basis of a list. In this regard, many experts have called for looking at this issue from a humanitarian perspective, but you should also remember what were the terms of the Assam Accord, which was signed long back between the Union government and the government of Assam. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the recent hike in the minimum support prices for the kharif crops announced by the central government. The government claims that it was done to assure a price of at least 150% of the cost of production, which is in line with the farm sector strategy announced in this year's budget. And in this regard, it relied on the estimates of input costs, which was actually paid by the farmers, as well as the value of unpaid family labor engaged in the field. However, the final hikes of some crops are even higher, like for example, MSP for Bajra is 97% over the estimated costs of production. On an average, the recent MSP hike is the biggest hike since 2013-14 and is seen as a much needed respite to the farmers. But with less than a year to go for the general election, the recent hike shows that the government has opted to reverse the abundant inflationary caution it had exercised previously with respect to fixing MSPs. Because when it came to power in 2014, it had advised state governments against granting any bonuses over and above the MSPs. And also, the budget this year had promised that the Niti Aayog would work with the center and states to put forward a foolproof mechanism in order to ensure adequate remuneration to farmers if the market prices fall below the MSP through government purchases or through a gap funding mechanism whereby the difference between the MSPs and the market prices is transferred to the farmers. Little has been done by the government in this regard, and it remains to be seen what the impact of the recent MSP hikes would be on the consumer price inflation. In this regard, the recent MSP hikes may result in a rise in rural incomes, but reforms in the agricultural markets are vital to prevent a distortionary effect on the farmers' choices of crops based on account of MSPs. Therefore, easing the stockholding limits under the Essential Commodities Act and avoiding frequent restrictions on farm exports are some of the key reforms which could go a long way in augmenting farmers' income. The next issue is regarding the Goods and Services Tax. The GST Council, as you know, is a cooperative mechanism between the center and the states to look into various issues concerning the implementation of the Goods and Services Tax. The recently held meeting has refrained from any further alteration in the tax rates which was done in the previous meeting. While the GST system has expanded India's tax base and brought more firms into the formal economy, there are several concerns like the revenue target for the first 3 months of this financial year is well short of rupees 1 lakh crore due to the steep rate cuts which were done prior to this. Even though the full impact of the rate reduction is yet to unfold, rating agencies Moody's has said that the impact is marginal and could be offset by stronger consumption-led growth and better tax compliance. The issue which was looked into by the recent GST Council meeting was with respect to the implementation issues of the GST and its compliance by small firms. Given that firms with an annual turnover of less than 5 crore constitute 93% of the registered taxpayers under the GST, the focus on this sector is a creditable move, and the council has decided that such businesses need no longer file cumbersome returns every month but have to do so only on a quarterly basis. The Council meeting has also adopted several consensual decisions like the push for digital payments by offering a cashback to consumers using the RuPay or the UPI platform. This indicates the center's keenness to retain a cooperative approach with states, which is the basic idea of the GST Council. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the CATSA Act or the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act. The act imposes sanctions on any country carrying out significant defense and energy trade with American adversaries, particularly Russia, Iran, and North Korea. India had raised its concerns over this legislation and had said that it would go ahead with the S-400 Triumph missile system deal with Russia regardless of the US law. In this regard, recently, a US Congress's report allowing the introduction of a presidential waiver for this controversial legislation will be greeted with a sense of relief in both India and US because not only did the US president object the CATSA Act, but also the US wants to partner with India in the Indo-Pacific, and such moves would only hamper India's military capabilities. Also, India is largely compliant with the demand made by the US that it reduce the defense relations with Russia and also strengthen the same with US. In this regard, India has significantly reduced its dependence on Russian military hardware with a proportionate increase in the defense purchases from US. Therefore, imposing sanctions on India would be unfair. In this regard, the modified waiver authority, as proposed by the Congress, will allow the President to waive off sanctions in certain circumstances for 6 months at a time, as long as he certifies that such waiver is in US's national security interests and does not endanger the ongoing operations. While this is a welcome move, there are other concerns in the bilateral relations between India and US, like the US demand to bring down the energy imports from Iran, which is currently the second largest supplier of crude oil to India. The issue might be taken up at the 2 plus 2 dialogue, which has been scheduled in September, but India has to be aware that the waivers, if granted, would be contingent on the US President's continued support to India's defense requirements, and given the unpredictable policy swings under the current president, India should not presume that its problems over the CATSA Act have been fully addressed. The next issue is regarding the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which comprises of the 10 ASEAN members and their free trade agreement partners, namely Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. If you can recall, a question on the countries involved in the RCEP had figured in this year's prelims examination. It is back in news as the negotiations have reached the final stage and there have been demands by several countries for members to step out if they have disagreements over the terms of the agreement. India is one among those countries which has raised several concerns with the RCEP negotiations, the first being greater access to Chinese goods, which could further worsen India's massive trade deficit with China. In order to circumvent this, India has demanded a differential market access strategy for China as well as increasing access for Indian goods such as pharma and agricultural products. The second concern is regarding the demands made by other RCEP countries for lower custom duties on several products and a greater market access than India has been willing to provide. Meanwhile, the more developed countries in the RCEP, such as Australia and Singapore, have been unwilling to accommodate India's demands to liberalize their services regime and allow greater mobility of Indian workers. Due to all this and the impending elections of some of the RCEP countries, including India, where there is a tendency of the governments to turn protectionist, the government must take into account the consequences of either slowing down the engagement with RCEP or walking out of the talks at this stage, because any such measure would give China a greater space in the regional trade and security architecture at a time when the US is pulling away from the multilateral trade agreements. Given the fact that the RCEP countries represent 40% of the global GDP and engagement with this community is in accordance with India's Act-East policy, the Indian government should remain engaged with the RCEP negotiations. On that note, I'm wrapping up today's news analysis. Do like, share, and comment to support this initiative. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.